He started working in Natal in 1961 in the Berg. I think he's one of the conservationists that knows the Berg the best. He's been around for 40 odd years and not away from the Berg at all. He's also been the CEO of the old Natal Parks Board and Envelo Wildlife. So yeah, an environmentalist in bone and marrow. As someone said the other day, if the economy is more important than than your country or the countryside, and also if you can really think that money is more important than that, please stop breathing while you are busy counting your money and see how far you get. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege then to introduce to you George. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, first, for inviting me here, especially to Richard and Sandra, who went out of their way to bully me into coming. And I was asked to give a little bit of an overview of the Drakensberg, and I thought I would focus on the Drakensberg as a World Heritage Site. And it was South Africa's first natural and cultural World Heritage Site, only the second to be declared in this country. And I'm going to take you back over a number of years, because I spent so much time as a game ranger living there, and there will be a little bit of thanks to people who helped the Drakensberg through various changes to the point where it was globally recognized as one of the most beautiful places in the earth. Now, the Drakensberg Park today consists of a piece of land of nearly 250,000 hectares, and it stretches from Royal Natal here all the way down to East Griqualand. And there's a piece of beauty everywhere. And I'm going to try and show you that very quickly before you've digested the starter, which will take me until about 11 o'clock. Right, so without further ado, I'll just take you quickly up the Berg. Sani Pass, within the park, is the only place that there's a roadway going up, and that they are going to tar it in the not too distant future, so it will make it a lot more accessible to a lot more people. It really is a spectacular area. And then Giant's Castle, which is the place where I spent 4 years, and which is very, very special to me indeed, so you're going to get a little bit more of that. It has got a beauty that is unmatched anywhere in the world. It's, of course, quite wrong to say that the Drakensberg is the most beautiful mountain range in the world, but it's certainly amongst the best. Not quite as high as the Himalayas, but you don't have to have height to be beautiful. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. We have plenty of snow, although this year we have been a bit short of it. In fact, we haven't had a winter at all in Haik. We didn't have a single frost this year. And in days of yore, when I was young, the 19th of April was the time we expected the first frosts. I hope we have frost before I keel over of old age in the not too distant future. The Cathkin is not all that far from here, the Northern Berg, and of course we have the Royal Natal National Park, of which I'll talk a little bit later. Now, the entire park is, as I say, 250,000 hectares. It's all the green, and then we have a buffer zone around it that we have planned. And in order to creep through to the status that we have today, the Department of Forestry, who used to own, manage a great chunk of the Drakensberg in the past, as they tried to grow trees and all sorts of things in there. Happily, we got rid of them and the trees, and it is all under the Natal Parks Board. In 1993, it was gazetted under our control. But before Forestry handed over, we had a chap called Bill Bainbridge who arrived with a thing called the National Physiographic Line. And he came up with a policy that above that line, that we weren't going to have any buildings at all. So he removed one of the mountain huts, Keith Bush Hut. And when he came to us, he said, we must knock down Tendele Camp, and we must knock down Giant's Castle Camp, which is in the Natal Parks, but it wasn't too charmed about. Now, we told him to get lost, and he went off and sulked for a few years. Now, the Natal Parks Board was a very disciplined organization. The people who didn't like us said we were autocratic. The people who did like us thought we were, that our discipline was fantastic, And Colonel Jack Vincent was our first director, and he was the person who brought his wartime experiences home and brought the rest of us up within his narrow lines of discipline, which meant if he said jump, you jumped. So nowadays, if the director, if they have one, tells you to jump, you tell him to jump. It's a completely different world. I prefer the old one myself. Now, he sent me up to Giant's Castle. When I arrived there just to try to get a job out of him, I couldn't ride, I couldn't drive a car, I couldn't speak Zulu, I'd never lived on my own, I knew nothing about the Drakensberg, and he looked at me and said, what promising material. so he said he's malleable. So he sent me up there, and the only thing I knew about Giant's Castle was where Bill Barnes, who was the resident warden at the time, had photographed the bearded vulture, which has become really an iconic animal in the Drakensberg, but especially at Giants, where we have a very good hide which brings the animals down. And this man, Bill Barnes, well, he is a legend of the Drakensberg. One of the things that have changed in this day and age is that we've lost the Bill Barneses. You know, everybody gets a 5-year contract, unless you're working for Eskom, in which 18 months is enough to get you a decent pension. But people like Bill Barnes was actually born in Giant's Castle, and he lived in Giant's Castle until the last 5 years of his life. So, and his father was the conservator there from 1917. So here was a man, rather like you farmers, grown up on the farm. Your father had the passion, you had the passion, you're totally tied into the land, and there are all sorts of things that you know. It's like community people living in the Umweni. They have been there all their lives, so the internal knowledge is just fantastic. And alas, in the job creation today, the gear is 5 years, you get a 5-year contract, and if they don't like the color of your eyes or anything else, you move on. So this sort of really intrinsic, in-depth experiential knowledge is disappearing in just about every single walk of life. And in the wildlife world, it is disappearing very rapidly indeed. Bill was just unbelievable, the things that he could recognize long before it became apparent to youngsters like me. And at the same time, he had the most incredibly wonderful set of game guards under George Malifa, who was just a man of such immense knowledge. It was a joy to be with him. And without that particular team, the Drakensberg would probably not have ended up as a World Heritage Site. So we owe these people an enormous debt of gratitude in 2017. The game guards were wonderful. They did most of the anti-poaching work for us. And as you can see, that was the police in the old days. You will notice the police were still wearing pith helmets. I wish some of them were still wearing pith helmets, quite frankly. They might get some work. We did a huge amount of walking and riding. Those were the two modes of transport that we indulged in. And of course, in those days, there were no chalets in the country. So I'm sorry about this. This is supposed to be A-rated, or X-rated, as Bill and I are taking a morning shower. Now, one of the great tools that came to the Drakensberg, because we're right in the fire season at the moment, and when we had these winds, when a fire broke out, it was very, very difficult to get across the berg to try and fight a fire quickly, because speed, as you all know as farmers, the quicker you get to the fire, the quicker you can hopefully get it under control. So a great gift to the Drakensberg was the 4x4 Land Rover, the Series 1 and 2. And I couldn't drive, so I had to serve in the vehicle by trying to stop it from going over backwards. And one of the problems was that although it was a wonderful tool for us, we actually got a bit carried away and we became rather cowboyish. We tried to go up the steepest hills possible. And when I was learning to drive in the old Chevy there, let's just say my skills were wanting. And Bill, who was trying to teach me to drive, wasn't always successful. Now, the things that we did with the vehicles was to access parts of the berg we couldn't go before. But of course, the berg topsoil is very fragile. And we actually did a lot of damage with 4x4 vehicles. Now, had we left it like that and had the Intel power board not set up systems and made sure that we were financed enough. We couldn't have fixed them up like this, where all those real bad damage that we did with the vehicles now actually looks very good and is holding together very well. Then, of course, there's fire. Fire, when we put it in, speaking we as farmers and game rangers, if we put it in and control it, it's a wonderful thing. When you have a wildfire, it is not so wonderful a thing, especially in the Drakensberg, where we don't have a very high grazing factor, and at the end of winter, we have a huge amount of fuel. And a wind like we had yesterday could make life very exciting. And in those days, everyone, all the staff worked at beating out the fire. And one of the things that I must acknowledge are local Hlubi staff and the Molifas, the Dlaminis and Lorves who worked for us. These men, especially the men who joined us at a TOC rate of 35 cents a day, they could beat a fire for 2 days. And we had very large beaters, as you can see here. And when I was young and full of myself, I thought, well, I'll just jump in the line and I'll fight, I'll bulla like the staff. Well, it took me about 20 beats and I was finished. And our black staff could beat for 2 days, singing to themselves the rhythm that was unbelievably impressive. And I realized that, well, my place is to be standing there asking, telling him nice which way to turn, but there is no way that we could match the stamina and the commitment of these men at 35 cents a day. Absolutely wonderful people. But when we do burn properly, and we burn according to guidelines we have found in the Drakensberg, that burning every 3 years gives us a spring. The greens of the Drakensberg and the Little Berg are just amongst the most beautiful things on earth. And our scientific studies have shown that a 3-year burn is the best. After that, we start to get too much of a buildup of surplus fuel, and it begins to pack and rain runs off the top. And one of the things that Bill Barnes was famous for is they used to fight with the Department of Agriculture, who had set very firm standards, and they were all based on agricultural burning and not wildlife burning. Bill was one of the first people to realize that we were looking after biodiversity, not cattle. So the bottom line was that just one burn at one time, all the time, was not the best way to go. So he started to put in little autumn burns to help our Oribi along, and also around the forest patches in order to stop the big dry fires going into the forest. So he was very far-sighted and used to fight like hell with the agricultural department, who would storm up the day after we put in an autumn burn and threatened to put us all in jail. They never did. I think they just liked the trip. And of course, the fire is necessary to generate the most incredible. We have 2,500 species of plants in the Drakensberg Park, and a lot of them, like the proteas, depend on fire. We don't get fire at the right time, the seeds don't crack, so the rains don't come, the seed doesn't germinate, which is why you see these stands of protea rupelli like this one, and they're all the same size. They don't appear to be any youngsters. But at one spring will come a time when we've had the fire at the right time, the rains have come at the right time, and suddenly there is a blanket of new protea. As thousands upon thousands of seeds germinate. They may have been lying there for years. So we're very fortunate that fire is a fire climax habitat. And then, of course, the 3-year burn has shown that it is the most productive for all of our small mammals. We have 44 species of small mammals in the park, and they are at their most productive and most numerous over 3-year burn periods. Again, if it's older than 3 years, the small mammals begin to move out of it, and we need the small mammals because they feed our raptors. We need the right size grass in order to maintain our game birds, of which we have. Bill's name, I might add, his Zulu name was Amadubula. He who shoots, because apparently when he was growing up in Giant's Castle, he used to spend all his time shooting grey wing. He loved shooting grey wing. But he became a very famous birdman. He and a colleague of his from Escort, Squeaker Simmons, they were really wonderful, wonderful birders. And we have 177 species of birds, many of them endemic, in the Drakensberg Park. Of course, it's becoming more and more important for some of our smaller antelope species like Oribi, as transformation has come in, where so much of our natural landscape has been converted to producing soya beans at astronomical quantities, maize, and of course trees. If Professor Warren had come from New Zealand, I would have probably thrown a brick at him for suggesting that we cover the rest of Natal with Pinus radiata, which would end the rest of our Oribi habitat. Then we have Vaal Rhebok, which is a montane species, also goes well into the Free State. And this last real stronghold in KZN is in the Quahlamba-Drakensberg National Park. We have Duiker, mountain reedbuck, southern reedbuck, steenbuck, really, and then Grijsbok. We have a patch of forest in Giants Castle Game Reserve called Grijsbok Bush, and apparently we shot one there in 1936 to send to the Empire exhibition in London. And it must have been such a shock because we've never seen one since. So it must have been a very rare stray that had come up from the Cape. And then, of course, we have our pest species in the Drakensberg. The baboon is a nuisance these days because the new policies of the new Nature Conservation Agency is that you can't shoot a nuisance animal because the animal belongs there and you don't. Well, I don't quite agree with that. Parks Board is much more pragmatic, and if we found a big bull baboon who'd learned to open the doors at the chalets, we shot him. Not allowed to do that anymore. Very sorry about that. Then, of course, we had the nuisance species, and we had probably a 20-year battle with the farmers who, as many of you will remember, the first stock that was brought into the Drakensberg back in the early part of the 20th century and 19th century were sheep. And, of course, the jackal thought this was Christmas and started to eat them. And then they attacked us because they said the park is breeding up jackal to come and eat our sheep. So we responded to this by getting a jackal pack. And this was our huntsman in 1962 was a Dane, a builder who had run out of jobs. And the colonel, with his usual inimitable style in picking suitable people for the job, appointed poor old Andy, who couldn't ride a horse. So we had great fun learning together. And we caught a lot of jackal over the years, and we placated the farmers saying, listen, we're doing our bit. And I know hunting these days is a bad thing. Even in Brexit Britain, they are talking about they have got rid of hunting from horseback after foxes. And I think it's a great tragedy because there is nothing quite like going out at 3:30 in the morning and riding along underneath the escarpment when the first sun's blush has come onto it, chasing a jackal and putting down a hole. Marvelous stuff. Then, and then no, knocking off a jackal when it's eating the Oribi, it's a matter of choice. We have fewer Oribi than we have jackal. So it's just a question of choice, taking out the one that is least important. Now, we're also very privileged, and one of the tools that helped us get the acknowledgement of the park as a World Heritage Site was thanks to Reg Pierce, who was the headmaster, my headmaster at Escort High School. I might add that I'm a local, and I was brought up and taught by this man, and he wrote Barrier of Spears, which made the whole sort of history and ecology of the Drakensberg Park much more available to the world at large. And he taught me a great deal, encouraged me to become a scientist, as a matter of fact. So, and again, we have an enormous wealth of species of amphibians. Our dwarf chameleons are amongst the most beautiful. We have these little sandfelt lizards, Euchrus delanda, which I'm sure many of you haven't seen, because you have to put your hands along the side of streams and stuff to pick them up. We have some very rare snakes, like the spotted harlequin snake, actually very poisonous, but it's so small that you have to put your finger in its mouth and wiggle it to get any real poison. Then we have the Polita snakes, like the old Pepatois, the ringcals, which Bill Barnes, I might add, strangely enough, was terrified of snakes. And I have seen more exciting dancers. Anthony down there was just telling me he's been to see the Lord of the Dance, and he thought the moves were fantastic. I can assure you, when a ringcal stood up next to Bill, flatly he wouldn't have a chance. Bill was just the most wonderful dog. And then, of course, Bill's other terror was the berg adder, which the local Klubi people believe could jump over a horse. They are bad-tempered little buggers at the best of times, but I've never actually seen one jump over a horse. And then Bill was a great climber. He was really opened a lot of routes and entered into going out on berg rescues, very dangerous ones. And these three gentlemen in the 1950s were amongst the most famous mountaineers in Africa. Another local is Martin Winter, whose grandfather, after whom Winterton is known, and Martin, alas, died last year, and Dr. Sherman Ripley, who's very active in the Mountain Club, organized the mountain rescue with the Air Force, and he died on the 7th of July this year at the age of 91. So these three men, we owe a tremendous amount of gratitude for all the climbing they did. I, of course, was dragged in as a climber, and I used to go climbing in my kilt, and I loved Giant's Castle. It was full of trout. I found that my kilt was very useful, especially if we were looking for new water. My friends would dress me up in my kilt and send me in, especially if it was an Afrikaans farmer, and to go and ask if we could fish the river. And I never had a single Afrikaans person ever refuse me. They thought I was some sort of crazy Rob Roy coming around. And in those days, the fishing was good. This fish was there to show our New Zealand guest, who wasn't here now to see it, that we too have brown trout in quantities in our rivers. Bill Barnes was an exceptionally good trout fisherman. And the reason for this is that the salaries for his family, his father and himself, were so low. These people kept cattle and sheep on the game reserve because there was simply no other way they could make money. And Bill learned his fishing, as Peter Root did down in Lotini, because they fished for food. It was a survival activity. It wasn't a snobbish upper class pastime. It was fishing for food, and as so many people have to do these days. And of course, we got some nice fish. This is David Cook, ex-college boy who came to join us in Giant's Castle with his 4-pound trout, which I consider to this day was totally undeserved because he was a dreadful fisherman. Now, this is a more novel way of fishing, and it's frowned upon by the purists. The reason I put this in is that a couple of years ago, the Department of Environment Affairs managed to get into its head that all trout should be removed. There was an activist who came up with the idea that trout were alien and they should be removed from all South African rivers. And the battle is still going on. The government has probably spent 5 or 6 million rand in this campaign, and I have no idea why, because trout have been here in the river since 1892. In fact, and they said it was eating the gilliminkies. Well, when we were blowing some holes in the Ngogwan River to make deeper holding pools for the winter, we went down, we rushed down afterward with a net to go and fetch out the trout we thought would have been killed. And we found thousands of gilliminkies, little Barbus anaplis, which are supposed to be wiped out by the trout. There are thousands of them in there, and we found one trout of 7 inches. So our fish have got many techniques of staying alive, and don't underestimate our Barbus. They're more than capable of doing this. But we did make mistakes in the Drakensberg. We brought black wildebeest, introduced them into the top of above the little berg, and they did very well for a very short time, and then it went down. They were very common in the then Natal because it was on the crest of the Natal Provincial Administration, the province of Natal, so we eventually moved them out. We brought blesbok from the Free State down in the early 60s, and they too did not do particularly well, and there are very few left. But the blesbok has been a great introduction to Natal. These ones are living in Amber Valley in Howick, and as you can see, they're old, contented, slightly plump, and in wonderful condition, and they love Amber Valley. I think it's a great improvement over the Free State. We also have hartebeest. Hartebeest was also a large and a very profitable export from the province of Natal right through the 19th century. And then in 1954, we had 3 left in this country in the Greytown district, and Colonel Vincent announced that we were going to capture them and put them into a park, and out went someone and shot them that night. And so I was then sent up with some colleagues to the Northern Cape, where I had to catch hartebeest from horseback, and everything in the Northern Cape digs holes. So when you've been riding around chasing hartebeest, make no mistake, your nerves give in after a while because it's the most incredible place. Anyway, we brought the first herds back in Natal, but of course Giant's Castle was set aside in 1903 by the very far-sighted colonial government of Natal before the Act of Union, and that was in 1903, and we've had eland there ever since, so we now have a national herd along the Drakensberg of about 2,000 animals, and quite a lot are shot by hunters on the farms around in the buffer zone of the province. And we caught a lot of animals when we were rangers. We used to rush out and catch them on horseback, rear them. They're lovely animals to deal with. And we even had a domestic herd. Professor Abbott from the University of Natal decided we should have a domestic herd because the Russians had one. And so we developed our own a domestic herd in Loteni. But we weren't the only people who chased eland on horseback. And one of the reasons why we have a cultural recognition for the park is the painting wealth that the Drakensberg San left behind when they left our province. Here's a shot of horsemen chasing eland, and of course horses were only introduced into Natal in the early 1800s. So these paintings are all very much more recent and come through almost to 1900. They also told us about species that have disappeared from the Berg, like the roan antelope here in Giant's Castle. This is a roan on top of the Nyika Plateau in Malawi, and they have eland there, and it looks just like the Natal Drakensberg. Even the eland also have the same characteristics as our eland have, and but we had there's no historical record of a roan antelope in the Natal Drakensberg area. But a year or two ago, one of my colleagues in the Cape, Carol Burst, has just completed a map of distribution of roan and shows that they came down into the edge, and there's probably no doubt whatsoever that either the San Bushmen saw them in the Free State part of the Berg or they used to actually visit, which is highly likely. They used to visit our parts of the Drakensberg. One of the richest sites for San rock art is the cathedral area. This is Eland Cave, and Eland Cave has one of the most fantastic friezes of rock art in the world. One of the real values of the San paintings here in KZN is that they had learnt a technique of polychromes. They could blend colors. Now, if you go to the Cederberg, you'll see lots of red paintings, and where you have white or black, they are bichromes. They are painted together, like Aboriginal rock painting. Aboriginal rock paintings are fantastic, and there are many of them, but they're all bichromes. There's dots and lines put over a basic color. The Drakensberg San learned to blend their colors and to much more realistically depict the eland, which was so important to them. It was their most valuable animal. It provided everything they wanted. And they're also very talented artists. Battle Cave showed battles with people being wounded. Further off the image, there are mothers holding back children who want to get involved. Then we have the sort of mystical creatures like the sorcerer. We have some splendid baboons who are obviously also entering the cave. Leopard, elephant. So we have a huge range of animals. One of the things that impressed the commission that came from the United Nations was the fact that we were making an effort to convey this wealth, preserve it, and interpret it to the people who would come to visit the park. And at Giant's Castle, we took steps back in the 1960s to protect the paintings that were in the main caves, and then with money from our conservation trust, we built scaffolding and walkways where people could approach but was just out of reach so that people couldn't touch them. The Dima Valley is the richest site for rock art in the whole park. Overall, we have at least 600 sites with rock art in it in the park. We're still finding more, and there are about 60,000 paintings of which we are aware. But like France, we didn't want to have people walking into the Dima Valley and going into some of the caves, so we recreated one shelter. It's called Oudendaal's Shelter, and we had a wonderful man who came, Laurie Robenheimer, who recreated this cave in its entirety. And there's 95 tons of concrete in this cave. And he did all the paintings, and that's Ndugiaki, who is our officer responsible for the Didima Rock Art Center. And it is a fantastic center, and the camp we built next to it at Didima, the whole thing was themed on the Drakensberg sand. Now, I just point this in as that when you go into the Free State and out to countries west, you don't have caves for people to paint in. So the sand of the Kalahari engrave on rocks. They make petroglyphs, and all of the style is exactly the same that is depicted in paint in the Drakensberg. This is the chairman of the Sand Council, who based over Uppington Way, and his wife. They came to the opening of our Rock Art Center. The other characteristic that the World Heritage Commission required is that we had facilities for people to come and visit the park. And starting at the highest levels, Bill had built this little hockey called Bill's Barn up near Giant's Castle. A typhoon picked it up and dropped it in Highmore. We built another one, Giant's Castle. And then we have built huts all over the Berg before Mr. Bainbridge came with his NFOG line. In 1950, we started building camps for people to come in, and they were fairly simple and they're very exposed. And if you look carefully at the environment around the camp, it was very bare. And so there are people of some vision that decided on these. And even 14, 15 years later, they were still fairly barren, and they were very simple. And of course, they cost 1 and 6 a night per adult in those days. People like that. And we still have people who say, why have you raised your prices? But look what happened. At the time, we had a visit from an American called Hogg, and he had written a book called Design with Nature. So you try to design your camps and stuff so they fit in with the environment. So that's what Giant's Castle looked like in 1964, and this is what it looks like today. If you look across there, it's very difficult to tell which is natural fallen rock and which are the units which people stay in. It is a truly successful camp. And then we built the Didima camp. The whole thing was designed to reflect the Sand people and their love and affection for the eland. And if you looked at the plain plan of the camp, each of these units represent a cave. And if you sit inside, you look out as if you're in a cave. So the architect designed that. Even the wedding ceremonies are all you're looking out, like looking out of a cave mouth. And the plan, all these units on the plan looked like eland hoof prints walking across the paper. It really was an incredible effort on behalf of a wonderful, wonderful architect called Derek Thomas. And then, of course, ending up here, not far from where we are, a national park was originally belonged to Zankel, who wanted to give it over and wouldn't give it over to the province in perpetuity unless it was named a national park. So it became, 1916, it became the Natal National Park. And it stayed that way until 1947, when we had royalty coming down. Umyani was there, and it got its name, Royal Natal National Park. We have a fantastic camp there at Tendeli, a very popular camp. And one of the criteria that you have to meet, or you should meet, for a World Heritage Site is it has to be a scene of magnificent natural beauty. And the Director General of the World Parks Commission kept telling me as we brought him along the Berg, yes, this is a very difficult one because everybody thinks that their park is the most beautiful in the world. And, we've got to be very, very careful, that this doesn't affect our judgment. Well, we walked the Director General and the party to the top of the Tugela Falls here, up the Sentinel Pass, around the back, over to the falls. And when he got to the top, he stood at the top of the Tugela Falls, he looked down over our fantastic province, and he said, wow. And we've got our World Heritage Site, we've got our cultural site, we've got our natural site, and it should be the pride of all South Africans. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. There are books available. The author is here to sign them for you if you would want some of the books on the Berg itself. So yes, they're going to be available tomorrow as well.
It is the year 1988. It is in Angola at Puerto Carnaval. How many of you were there? Anybody who was there in 1988? Ah, no, there's one of his, perhaps his beers. One of my friends told me this story. It's a true story. He was in that battle, and they shot to kill. I mean, the enemy shot to kill, and they shot to kill. And years later, they discovered on Facebook some of the Russian guys who were also in that battle. And then they started befriending these Russian guys who they fought against. And to make a long story short, a group of South African guys who fought in that battle, who realized they were shooting at these people, went over to Russia. And what a ball did they have. They had the time of their lives as the Russians opened their arms of hospitality and took them through Russia. And apparently after a lot of vodka, there was a guy called Van Zyl who was on the table dancing. But anyway, an enemy is only a friend that you don't know yet. I think one of the most difficult and most biggest giants we're faced with in South Africa today are our relationships, and especially across racial borders. Jesus has defeated that enemy. Jesus has died. That's one of the very specific things Jesus has died for, to restore relationships. And it might not be easy to defeat this giant in South Africa. But we have to face this giant, and we have to be part of the restoration process. But that's not the main message this morning. So we come to the end of the David and Goliath story in 1 Samuel 17 verse 50. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in the hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. So in a matter of hours, a shepherd boy who was armed with a slingshot and his faith in God slain down the giant, and he killed Goliath. And he took down the giant that the whole Israelite army couldn't face in 40 days. Now Jesus comes in John 10 verse 11, and he says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Your shepherd, Jesus, will do exactly the same for you as what David has done for the Israelite army. Psalm 23 verse 5, David says, you prepare a table before my enemies. You prepare a feast in front of my enemies for me. Jesus has promised to lead us, to protect us, and to guide us. And he doesn't do this in the absence of our struggles, but in the very presence of our enemies. As the pressure of darkness and struggle closes in around us, your shepherd Jesus spreads out a table there in front of your enemies. And he doesn't want you just to survive there as you struggle, but to navigate your path to freedom. Revelations 5 verse 5. Jesus is not only a shepherd, but he's a roaring lion of Judah. But there's an enemy walking around. And we all know this enemy, the devil, and he's real. And this enemy of ours will try his very best
to get a seat there at your table that Jesus is preparing for you. He will do his very best to erode, slowly but surely, your confidence in God. Just like what is happening when that 1 millimeter of soil disappears off your land every year. You are not fighting this alone, but the devil would want you to believe that you are alone. The devil would want you to believe that the giants can never fall. That is the best time we can agree with David, that even when we go through the darkest valley, that we can fear no evil, for God is with us and our shepherd is with us. David knew God had everything under control. In the dark times, God was right by his side, walking with him through that valley. We can have exactly the same trust in God, but only if we refuse our enemy a seat at our tables. You cannot allow him that. If the enemy is at your table, you won't make it. He will tell you, there's something better at another table. God is just holding out on you. He's not really with you. But we have to choose to believe that our shepherd promised to lead us through this valley. And he's always with us. And he knows the best for us. And that we are his beloved children. I want us to close our eyes. And I want us just to imagine something. So let's all just sit. And let's just close our eyes. I want us to take a seat at God's great table. I want us to sit down at God's great table and just be still for a moment. Just enjoy the presence of our Heavenly Father. Just enjoy the fact that our Lord Jesus is the one serving us. I want you to hear the promise of God that He is with you. And He made the promise Himself in Matthew 11 verse 28. If you are heavy and weary and heavy laden, He will be with you. He is with you. Let us just enjoy the presence of God, our Father in heaven. You want us to sit at your table. Our Lord Jesus, in Revelations we read that you are the one serving us. And in the words of David, it's in the midst of our enemies, in the midst of our giants that we face. And our Father, we pray that we will learn to focus less on our enemies around us. We pray that we can focus more on the fact that you are with us. We pray that you will help us to move forward in the victory that you've conquered for us already. And our Father, we praise you for the fact that we can watch one after the other of our enemies fall, because Jesus is fighting them for us. We pray this in your name. Amen.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start off our day with the pests and the diseases. Professor Johnny van der Berg is all the way from the Northwest University. Thanks, Professor, for coming up here and coming to share your knowledge with us. You know, it's one of the biggest problems, most probably after weed control, is pest control with no-till. So, Professor's going to give us the right way to do it. Thank you very much for sharing all your wisdom with us. We really appreciate it. Bye, donkey, Professor.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation to speak here this morning. I was given this daunting task of answering these two questions, and I'll try my best as we go. I'm going to talk in this next 40 minutes about biodiversities, and I want to specifically tell you about results from 3 studies we did, long-term studies on predators, specifically ladybirds, on total diversity, and then on CA systems and how the diversity compares between CA and conventional agriculture. And then I want to talk about habitat management, and I want to convince you that smell and communication is everything. Now, this communication, gentlemen, is not that type that your wife always tells you, please talk to me. It's something different, so relax. I'm not going to go that way. And in this habitat management section of the talk, I want to talk about the push-pull habitat management system, which I'm sure several of you have heard about, and briefly refer to maize and sugarcane. So the first question, how diverse is our agro-ecosystems? I am going to give you the answers to these questions right now and then talk about something else for the rest of the time. So I want to start by saying our agro-ecosystems is extraordinarily diverse, and I'll show you why I say that later on. And it provides multiple ecosystem services. The next question, are we close to using environmentally friendly management systems? It depends on what you consider environmentally friendly. Does it mean you don't use any insecticides? That's not really practical. The philosophy of integrated pest management, of IPM, actually implies the combined use of any possible strategy to suppress pest numbers, because you can't eradicate a pest, and use these methods in an environmentally friendly way, keeping in mind the bottom line. And as we heard yesterday several times, being in the red means you can't be green, I think, if I quote several people correctly. So I'm going to talk about integrated pest management in general also. If you look at this pyramid showing IPM tactics, what we have here is where these things at the bottom here is what comes into play when you do conservation agriculture. Cultural control, meaning good sanitation, habitat modification, that's what you do when you do CA. Planting trap crops and barriers and increasing biodiversity. And these actions, of course, leads to increased biological control of pests and in some cases diseases and weeds, which I'll show today, in CA systems. And then, of course, comes, if we can't solve the problem that way, we start using insecticides. So I'm saying current maize ecosystems in South Africa falls within this in general. And of course, as you move upwards in that pyramid, the toxicity of the measure that you use increase. And environmentally friendly pest management would imply that you use insecticides only as the last resort. So it's all about biodiversity and about smell and communication. But let's start at the beginning with a fig tree. You all recognize this picture of Adam and Eve right at the beginning. And that's where a good talk should start, at the beginning. And if you look at this fig tree, it's one of those trees with the most diverse shapes of leaves that there are. And that's where diversity became important in the world. Because Eve, and that's where all our problems started, gentlemen, Eve didn't know what to wear. Should she have this one or there, or that's where the trouble started. But luckily there's diversity, and diversity solves problems. There's something for the week, something for Friday, and something for the weekend. So diversity is important. And if you look at this slide, it shows us something amazing. You know, scientists estimate that between 10 and 5,000 years ago, humanity on the planet made use of 3,000 plant species to sustain life on the planet for us. 3,000 of the 400,000 plant species were used to feed and clothe us. And today, things are not as nice. These 4 plant species supply between 60 and 70% of the calorie intake of people on the planet. We are on thin ice when it comes to biodiversity. And that is why the objectives, whether you farm in the backyard, in your garden, or on a farm, should be to conserve biodiversity wherever you can, since increased diversity is important, and we should learn to exploit the benefits that it provides. But how do you do it? In a farmer that farms in a very, very dry area, he's got extremely limited options when it comes to crop rotation or intercropping and that type. How do we do it? I don't have the answer, but I'm sure we're moving in the right direction. I want to show you some examples. How do you do it? And talking to a large group of no-till farmers, of course you'll understand this figure. The fundamentals of no-till farming. Moving from using a number of implements, reducing that until you get to no-till. And I'm sure you understand that. If I have to transfer this or relate this to biodiversity, I want to show you this figure. Starting off with a monocrop, another monocrop, but at least there's some crop rotation, and then using different crops, increasing this, eventually having fallow land, paying attention to what's happening around your field. The problem that we have and the solution to the problems is not inside the field. It lies in the ecosystem around it. And it is extremely important that we realize the benefits of the biodiversity on the other side of the fence around the maize field. And I want to talk a lot about that today. So why is biodiversity important? Because species richness provides ecosystem functioning. And only when we know the value of specific species and its contribution to ecosystem services and to pest control or pollination, for example, do we value these species. And if you look at this pristine sunflower field, it's beautiful, but it's a monocrop, and it's the best place to be for a sunflower pest. Left or right, up and down, there's food to eat. And this environment of monocropping provides an increased habitat for pests, but it diminishes the habitats for beneficial insects, the natural enemies of pests. And if we go on to this CA field on the left, which is not extremely diverse in its plant species diversity, we see the differences already. That type of diversity in this field already provides huge benefits in terms of pest control and, of course, then soil conservation, soil erosion, wind erosion limiting. So just by doing this type of activity, we are doing the following. And I want to split this, the pillars of ecological pest management, I want to split this into below ground habitat management and above ground habitat management. If you reduce tillage, if you maintain soil cover and add organic matter, you are changing the below ground biota. You're activating the biota that is there to provide benefits to you. If you do this, crop diversity, if you do rotations, if you plant cover crops, and you select the right cultivars, you're doing above ground habitat management. The plants are diversified in terms of species, and that enhances the beneficial organisms that occur above ground. And I'm going to give you excellent examples of that. So I want to share with you 3 examples and good news from the research that myself and many of my students, I only talk about the work, they actually do it, and colleagues at the ARC in Potchefstroom did. And I want to talk about the predators, ladybirds specifically. In one study we did about total diversity and then diversity in CA systems. And I start off with this photo that one of my students took. What we did was a small study about ladybird and spider diversity in and around maize fields. And what we did was to divide this ecosystem. And we are definitely, when I say ecosystem, not talking about the maize field only. We're talking actually about what's going on around it. We divided it into a maize field, the field margin, the venakker, and then the natural grassland on that side. And did surveys on about 30 farms, and we came up, and I'm just giving you some results on the ladybirds. Huge diversity of ladybirds. We found 11 species of ladybirds. Of course, very beautiful, and that's why we chose this. The number of species inside maize, the number of species of ladybirds was higher than in the transitional zone or the grassland. And the abundance of ladybirds was much higher inside maize than on the outside. And then there are people that are saying, listen, maize farming, extensive farming is really bad for natural biodiversity. It's actually higher in some cases inside maize fields than outside. And these two common species of ladybirds, which I'm sure you recognize, or I hope you'll recognize after this, if you look at this graph, their numbers. Inside maize, large numbers, and in the other two areas a little bit less. But this specific species only occurs in maize ecosystems. So it is our best friend. And why is it important and why are they there? This little different shaped species occurs in high numbers everywhere. Why are they there and why are they important? They control, firstly, aphid numbers early in the season, and they are the most common predators of insect eggs, of spider mites, and those type of organisms. They are important. And if I show you this graph, it shows the other species of predators we collected. This is inside the maize field. Ladybird numbers were very high, but spiders, unfortunately, not so high. If you look at the area just outside of the field, we're talking about an area about 30 meters outside of the last maize row, you get very high numbers of spiders. And then 50 or 100 meters away from the maize field itself, you can see a large number of predators, including praying mantids and so on. So the diversity there is high, and we should be proud of it. The other study that we did over a number of years, we asked the question, how does insect and plant diversity change if you walk from the middle of your maize field for another 400 meters to the other side, on the other side of the fence? And this was huge work which we did all over the country in maize production regions. So we did surveys from there on a transect outside of the maize field for 600 meters. Quite a lot of walking. And we had plots inside the maize field and then outside like this. And what we found in that study was 840 different plant species in and outside the maize fields. And we counted 39,000 insects of 1,000 different species. And an extremely low proportion of what we found were actually pest organisms. And if you look at this graph, you can see, or we answer the question, is agriculture bad for biodiversity, or maize agriculture at least? And I show you this is inside the maize field, 200 meters inside and 100 meters inside, and this is in the transitional zone in the Venakker. You can see that insect diversity is a little bit lower inside the maize field. There's always a spike in diversity around the fenced area because plant diversity is higher and there's a lot of insects occurring there. But then for 400 meters outside of the field, the diversity doesn't really change. And we have a number, as I showed you, of beneficial organisms that occur there. So the field margins, Venakkers, between 30 and 100 meters from maize fields have the same plant and arthropod diversity than areas hundreds of meters away from the maize field as you're getting in towards natural areas. So our results indicated from this long-term study that our maize production systems are not species-poor ecosystems, so they're surprisingly rich in diversity. And they are of conservation value. Or the worst thing that can happen is if this transitional zone is burnt, because that's where diversity is hosted and sustained during winter months specifically. In that survey of 39,000 insects that we collected and I identified, 0.0001% were pest species individuals. That doesn't mean they had pest status in those fields at that stage. They were just pest species that could, if their numbers increased, become economically important and warrant a spray. But it shows you the biodiversity that's locked up. And in the third study done by Heidi Meyer and Annemie Erasmus and myself about CA, and she shared some of these results with you guys here last year, we looked at specific insects in CA and conventional farming systems. We looked at predators and the pests and some other species. And this girl, for her master's degree studies, worked through 37,000 different pitfall traps, sorted out and counted 500,000 insects and identified them. And took pictures of most of them, which I used as confirmation to identify, to check that at least the student doesn't cheat and she's right with what she's doing. So this unbelievable project done at the ARC, which has now been stopped after 3 years, is based on a huge amount of data. I can't think of another study in the world on maize biodiversity that did this large volume of work. So if I tell you CA is good for you and for biodiversity, we base it on fact. It's not something pie in the sky. And I'm going to share a limited amount of results with you. This picture shows the number of predators that we found of different groups. These are the earwigs, but these carabid beetles, tiger beetles, some of them as small as 5 millimeters, and these big oogpisters, which you all know, they occur a lot in CA fields. And these graphs show CA, 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 and the purple is a conventional field. So you can see significantly lower numbers of these beneficial predators in CA fields, and they are important soil insects doing predation at that level. And if you look at the total number of predators, including sucking pests and ants and this wingless ant, we can see that CA does outperform the conventional totally in terms of predators. If you look at the incidence of pests, we see exactly the opposite, except for this one group where in one of the CA farms the toktokies outnumbered the rest. But if you look at the incidence of pests, the opposite is true with regards compared to the predators. In the conventional, the number of pests running around on the soil is significantly higher than the other groups. So the bottom line of this huge amount of work that was done is the diversity of insects and beneficial insects in conventional compared to CA systems. There's a huge difference. This was the same result over 2 different seasons, and the third season showed the same. The CA system is hugely beneficial. CA promotes biodiversity. It, as I just showed you, it provides a healthier ecosystem, a more stable ecosystem, and it provides significant ecosystem services. And what do I mean by that? Ecosystem service, something like pollination or predation. And in terms of humans, you can say the ecosystem services provided by maize is food. And another one which we often forget is the issue of seed, of weeds on a field. If we look at this one, this graph shows you predation on cutworms. In a CA field, we get 75% of the cutworms that we put out was removed or damaged by predators. In a conventional field, only 25% of the cutworms were eaten up by predators. And then something we always forget, seed predation. 50% more of the seeds of weeds that we put out in a CA field were removed or buried or eaten compared to the numbers in conventional fields. It's something that we often forget when we think about the value of diversity. And if we compare predation on stem borer pupa and stem borer larvae between CA and conventional farms, we see a huge difference. In every case here, this is on one farm. Each of these areas is one farm. In this study area, on the conventional farming system, only 20% of the Caelu partalis larvae that we put out were predated upon. In the CA system, 70%. And the pupa, same tendency. In this study area, again, another CA farm and another conventional farm, same tendency. So we see that there is significant contribution in terms of predation provided by biodiversity and CA systems. But of course, I can ask the question, does genetically modified BT maize contribute to environmentally friendly pest control? And there are varying opinions about this. Some people say, a BT maize plant is just another way of applying toxin into the ecosystem. Other people will say, no, maybe it's more environmentally friendly than that. And I'll get to that. Because I realized yesterday from several of the talks that there could be some tension about whether to use GM or not. What are our alternatives if you want to control stem borers or pests? Other than BT maize? Well, burning, of course. It kills everything. The diseases are gone. Most of the insects are gone. It's an excellent way of controlling pests. But what are the disadvantages if you weigh that against advantages? And of course, you can apply in crop residues. You will kill fall armyworm pupa if they will be overwintering there. You kill nearly all the stem borer that overwinter, the cutworms and so on. Excellent control idea. But what are the disadvantages? If you plant BT maize, it's another alternative. And the default position that we will have is to spray again insecticides. So with the BT maize that we plant, we have relatively target-specific BT toxins that kill certain pest species, while if we go back to insecticide sprays, we have broad-spectrum control, which kills nearly everything on the field, and in most cases, 99% of the natural enemies that we so dearly want and that we increase their numbers through the CA systems. And of course, if you plant BT maize, and this is one of the benefits that we often overlooked in the past, which was an accidental discovery by a friend of mine in the US, that farmers that do not plant BT maize, the non-adopters, also benefit largely in the long run from the neighbor that plants BT maize. And I want to show you this very interesting data set. And I can't believe that these guys in the US have this accurate long-term data. On this axis is the number of stem borer larvae in 100 plants, and they did this recordings regularly since 1962. Every year, no GM crops, of course, at that stage. Here you can see the cycle of European corn borer over the decades as it's going. And then this gray area shows when the farmers in Minnesota started planting BT maize to control this pest. And then these white dots just go down. The pest was effectively controlled. So when the BT maize was being adopted by farmers rapidly between 1995 and 2010, you can see the adoption rates. And the number of stem borers on non-BT maize, those farmers that didn't adopt BT maize, significantly decreased as well. And we talk about a halo effect. BT maize seems to act like a sink, just suppressing at a landscape level the incidence of stem borers over a long period. So there is some other benefits locked up in this type of technology. So I want to summarize in the middle of my talk about the biodiversity. We have biodiverse maize production systems, and I think we are close to using largely environmentally friendly practices. And then reduced tillage increases the biodiversity of beneficial insects. That's very important that we remember that and keep it in mind. But then I said, how can we now do this? How can we manipulate or increase or exploit this biodiversity in the services? And this is where I said, everything in life depends on communication and smell. Smell is everything. I always say smell is the glue that keeps social interactions together and interactions in nature together. 30 years ago, it was unthinkable to tell people that plants are talking to each other and plants are talking to insects. And I want to give you scientific results from own studies and student studies on this. And I want to discuss with you the attraction and repellence values provided by plant biodiversity and how we can use this to manipulate pests. And this is a very common scene in the northern KZN with the sugarcane production areas. And I'm now getting towards the applied side of using biodiversity or plant species diversity, if we could increase this. Usually, when we farm like this, we are concerned about the areas I colored in. What we want to do, if there are pests, we want to plant resistant varieties and we want to control them chemically if they are there. But we forget about what's going on in that natural area where there's increased habitat for the pests also, but largely for their natural enemies. So how can we exploit what is there between the fields or in the Venakker, in the transitional zone between the maize field and the wild grass field? And I'm going to give you an example of this push-pull system, which I have been involved in since 1993 in Kenya. and then also in South Africa. Unfortunately, it didn't take off very well in South Africa due to a lot of practical reasons. In this system, the farmer wants his main crop of maize to be protected against stem borers. We're talking about stem borers only. In order to do that, we discovered that a trap crop, specific trap crop species, will attract the moths. And then also discovered that Desmodium, an intercrop, which farmers were initially not keen on planting there, were smelling bad for the moths. And when they fly around at night, they would fly into the maize field, smell this very nice Napier grass, go into the maize to lay their eggs, but there's this kind of repellent intercrop, and then eventually it ends up laying most of the eggs on the trap crop. And then years later, it was discovered that this Desmodium, also one of the smells it emits, which we can't smell, is attractive for parasites of stem borers. So now we're getting a push and pull system. Very interesting. And how does it look in the field? This is how it looks. And the largest area that it would be effective on is about 0.5 of a hectare. But I'll get to the contour uses and trap crops on its own later on. This is a sorghum field where push-pull is done in Kenya. There you see the sorghum. It could be maize just as well, with a Desmodium and Napier grass around it. And you can see this row of Napier grass has been cut recently. This one maybe 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago. And this all goes as biomass in that cut and carry system that they have with the cattle on kraal in Kenya and Uganda and most of East Africa. This is how it looks in the field. Extremely effective against stem borers. And eventually, when this system was running, everybody forgot about the pest control value that the push-pull system had. Because its largest value was improving soil quality, fixing nitrogen through the legume in between, and improving livestock health, improving milk production, and we heard this term stacking yesterday, of making use of everything on the plot. Eventually, farmers are now making the most money out of this whole system by selling the seed of the Desmodium, which they harvest in between the maize or sorghum rows. A very, very good system, thought out, planned, and so on. And this is Desmodium between maize, and this is a picture I took in Kenya, where you can see the Napier grass here, the area where the farmer would walk or people would walk, Desmodium and maize. And accidentally, after this project was running about 5 years, it was discovered that through allelopathy, the Striga parasitic weed population was nearly nullified in maize, in these plots. The Desmodium roots give off a certain chemical that causes abortive germination of the Striga parasitic weed seed, now, which makes them germinate, and then they can't find the maize roots to attach to, and then the small seedling dies. This was all sorted out chemically now. This is so well documented. Which smells from maize attracts moths, which smells from the Desmodium repels them, which smells attracts parasitoids, and then also, and I think maybe 10, 15 years from now, we could hear of a genetically modified maize that emits its own volatiles to call or repel pests, and even to emit some root exudates to control Striga. That's probably the way this is going. This is a picture, I just want to put it in case you do not believe the fact that I tell you that plants talk to each other. This is part of an experiment we did with melanus grass, Melanus mendiflora or molasses grass on the sides, putting maize plants in between for a week, and then we remove the maize plants and put them in cages where the moths are supposed to lay eggs on them, and then the moths don't want to, because the melanus grass emits a chemical message that the maize takes up to start its defense, and the maize then gives off another chemical product or compound which chases the moths away from the plant. So we talk about priming of plants. This is so simple, those plants are talking to each other there as they are standing. I don't know what they say at sunrise or sunset, but during the day at least they are above board. Beautiful maize desmodium intercropping system. And this is how it looks in the field when the crop is still young. On the side, there's a forage sorghum trap crop for stem borer moths. We've got the maize rows and the desmodium intercropped in between. The desmodium fixes nitrogen. The sorghum on the sides is chopped off regularly to go as biomass for animal feed. And eventually the desmodium seed is also sold. Just another example of Melanus maize intercropping. And this picture which I took is one of the things that says most about pest or disease or parasitic weed management that I have learned in my 30 or odd years in this field. The only difference between this plot and that plot is that there was desmodium intercropped with maize for 4 years compared to this plot. The desmodium there totally destroyed the Striga wheat bank. We have in South Africa Striga asiatica as a small plant with a red flower that attaches to maize roots or sorghum roots. This Striga hermontica, which they have in East Africa, is vicious. You can see it looks beautiful here, but it's growing on the roots of maize plants and stealing the nutrients. So there's no fertilizer applied to that maize. No fertilizer applied here, and you can see the effect that increased plant species diversity have in systems such as this. And I'm not even going down the road of increased pest control here in the push-pull system. But the push-pull system may be too complicated for some areas, and the climate may not be suitable. So I went another avenue, and this is work we have done in Limpopo province, north of Thohoyandou, where we only used the pull component of push-pull. That's the trap crop. And we used Napier grass or elephant grass or Pennisetum purpureum as trap crops on the sides of small maize fields like this, about half a hectare. And we saw between 15 and 20% reduction in stem borer colonization of this crop. In many cases, the farmers don't apply granules anymore to control the stem borers here. And then they chop this off and very often don't sell it, but barter it for kraal manure from farmers that live north of the Soutpansberg in dry areas where they don't have enough food for their cattle. Another example where I was involved in a project near Polokwane, and this is not a very good picture, but it is a farming area that was laid out on a slope, and the farmers wanted to plant maize. That was what the Provincial Department of Agriculture's mandate was. And then I recommended that we plant Napier grass as a trap crop. And here you can see on this small piece of land, if you add it all up, there's about 5 to 8 kilometers of contour planted to Napier grass, which in dry years like we've had the previous season, serves a lot to provide biomass for animals. And a surprising result that I see every time when I go back there, the soil erosion which was stopped by this. On certain sides of this, on certain areas here in this scheme, the farmers did not plant Napier grass on the contours, and their farms, or small plots at least, is nearly non-existent at the moment. Lastly, I want to show to you briefly the application of this push-pull management in sugarcane. And this is the old friend of mine, Des Conlon at Mount Edgecombe. You know, sugarcane stem borers attack sugarcane. But there are more sugarcane stem borers, Eldana, in the papyrus around sugarcane fields. This is where they initially came from. But the parasitoids, the natural enemies, don't go into sugarcane. They don't smell that the pests are there. So we came up with a system where we're trying to exploit the biodiversity. You know, in the papyrus, there are many Eldana stem borers and many natural enemies of them. And how can we pull them into the fields? By planting Melanus grass, again, the same that's used in the other push-pull system, we are sending out chemical signals that smell nice for the parasitoids, which then come into the sugarcane. And the people at Mount Esh came up with this complicated but highly effective system, where they are now really asking farmers, and there are 2 or 3 nurseries that started, where nurseries are cultivating indigenous plants. By planting this in the waterways, by planting melanus grass in between the sugarcane, by planting BT maize there, what's happening is that we have natural hosts that host the pests, melanus that attract the parasitoids, BT maize that attract Aldana, and then what we have is that the pests move out into these natural areas, and the parasitoids move into those areas. And this is actually happening on a number of farms. So you can see the benefit that lies in increasing plant species diversity. Benefits in CA systems, if we're looking at soil insects, ladybirds, and so on, is huge. The benefits in increasing plant species diversity through alley cropping or intercropping or cover crops can be just as big, which I showed you in this last slide about the sugarcane. Now we can stop there. So I'm done. Thank you very much for listening to me. Go ahead and conserve our biodiversity, please. Thank you very much.
Professor Johnny, thank you very much. Right, everybody always says, there's a no-go in the sandy soils for no-till. Ken has proven everybody wrong. He's a farmer from the Viljoenskroon area. He's done it successfully. He's done it on a big scale. So yeah, Ken, thank you very much for coming to share us. I hope that you will convert some of the other sandy soil farmers.
What is an understatement? I hope you all understand what the word understatement means. If it's a bitterly cold day, some people will say it's cooling down. On a blazing hot day, some people will say it's warming up. Some of my friends back in Viljoenskroon will say when the temperature gets to 38 or 35, they will say, die ergste winter is nou verby. What is an understatement? An understatement gives you a measure of the truth and is a true statement, but it underestimates the importance of what you're saying. A man was found in the Thames in London with cement on his shoes. There was a bullet hole through his head. There was a knife sticking out of his back. And police divers took him out. And on the BBC that evening, the announcer announced that there had been a statement from Scotland Yard saying, police had not ruled out foul play. That is an understatement. When I tell you that the concept of no-till is a good concept, that is a wild understatement. I will ask you later, at the end of my talk, if somebody came along to you today and said, I want you to give up no-till farming. Or, let's put it differently, I want you to sell your no-till concept. What price would you put on it? Could you put a price on it? Most of us who've gone into conservative agriculture, or no-till as I call it, cannot put a price on it. And it's not for sale anyway. And yet, it's freely available. And yet, why do large portions of the Western Free State, the Western Transvaal, and the Free State continue with the old methods of farming and their fields blow away every year? What is it in us? Are we too stubborn? What is it? Why has no-till not swept through this country like a bushfire? What is it in us? In the Bible, there was a man who discovered a treasure in a field. And when he discovered what the treasure was, he decided that he would sell everything to obtain that treasure. But to obtain the treasure, he had to buy the whole field. And I think that's what some of the no-tillers and the conservative agricultural guys have done. They have put all their weight, all their enthusiasm, all their energy into obtaining this priceless gift that actually is available for free. We saw a picture yesterday, and I had to smile because I guess it was on one of the MSC cruise liners, of a man sitting reading a no-till magazine. That man had found this incredible treasure and was so engulfed and enamored by the treasure that he was prepared to go on his 30th honeymoon and read a no-till magazine. Richard and Aunt Muirhead and all the other Natal farmers that I don't know have found a treasure so precious and so unbelievably unbelievable that they are so dedicated to this cause that even in his vast age, Richard would be prepared to run a conference like this. So they must have found something extremely valuable. The next point I want to make is that we're all given a second chance. On the 22nd of January 2016, I caught a plane from Bloemfontein to see a cardiologist in Cape Town, and 2 days later, I had a quad bypass. There was nothing wrong with me. When they had a look at me, they said, "You need a quad bypass," and did it on Sunday morning. And when I said to the cardiologist, "Moet ons nie eers kerk toe gaan nie," he said, "Daar's nie nou tyd vir kerk, broer." I got another chance. I met a man yesterday just walking down the road here who had survived cancer. He's been given another chance. And so it is with our farming in the Western Free State. We've been given a second chance. When Richard asked me to speak originally, I'm just an ordinary farmer and I'm not very good at this. I wanted to give you something. You've had a lot of technical stuff. I wanted to give you a talk, not very technical, but something that you could leave here with, understanding what you people have heard and received. There's something very precious. I titled my talk, "I Ran Out of Horsepower." I was planting 2,500 hectares of maize, sunflowers, potatoes, and peanuts. Our process was to disc, to mark the lands, to chisel plow, to cultivate again, to plant, to cultivate, and to spray. And I was running out of horsepower. My tractors were getting old. And I had to make a choice whether I was going to get completely new equipment or stay with the old and continue or reduce my size of my farming. We were always changing filters that had been clogged up by the dust. Sometimes there were not enough drivers to man the tractors. I know one farmer who kept Ford 5000s parked in his garage, 10 or 15 Ford 5000s. They didn't even have alternators. They had pulleys just in case the wind started blowing. The question was always, in those days, was, why are those tractors standing in the sheds? They should be in the fields. And thank goodness that concept has now changed. Why are those tractors in the fields? They should be in the sheds. Our biggest problem, and certainly the Western Free State, Western Transvaal and Northern and Western Free State is wind blowing. And wind blowing is caused entirely by the activity on the field, tractor activity and movement of cattle and implements. Many of you haven't experienced wind blowing, don't understand what wind blowing really is, wind erosion. Within half an hour of getting 10 millimeters or even 20 millimeters of rain on that field, with a decent northwest wind, at 9 o'clock in the morning, those fields would be blowing. So, in the early 1950s, remember that up until the end of the war, everybody was planting 3-foot rows with oxen and small tractors. They were using barber backs to cultivate and try and keep the lands clean. But in the early 50s, they discovered that wonderful thing called the 7-foot rows, where you could get a tractor down the center of the row and keep it clean. And not anticipating the wind blowing that would result from that constant cultivating of the lands, people, including my father, couldn't believe that they could control the weeds like they did with small tractors, 265 tractors running up and down the 7-foot rows. The best thing of all was when you disked your lands and got it into a nice fine tilth and a decent seed bed, and you'd planted your mealies, or your sunflowers, or your peanuts, we put a rolling cultivator over it. Because my father said, my boy, there are a lot of weeds waiting to come up, you better kill them. And that's what we did. And of course, every time we did it, it made the soil finer and finer and finer, and that was the result. Some of you here might remember what a windploeg was. Now, a windploeg was in effect just a bar with two varkore. Some of you won't know what a varkore is. It's a big share with two big wings on it, a ridger type implement. And when the wind did that on our 7-foot rows, we'd get every available tractor out and we would run up and down the fields, disturbing the soil and breaking the crust of the soil to stop that wind. Because a wind like that, within a half an hour, would burn your mealies black. So we were sitting with a problem. The other thing which we loved to do was to run our cultivators right against the row of the mealie, especially with a nice big varkore on the right-hand side, to throw enough soil into the mealie plant to cover the germinating weeds. Can you imagine the root destruction? With the advent of weedicides, our lives changed completely. My friend Kobus van Coller, who's not unfortunately here, was the pioneer of no-till in our area. And he went against the grain. He was criticized, he was laughed at, he was sneered at. I remember speaking to him at the golf club one day, and he said, I really have learned not to take the jibes and the mocking. He said, gee ons net 'n bietjie tyd. He was the pioneer of no-till in our area. He has shallow soils, and he's producing good crops year after year after year. I used to watch his operation. I used to go down most Saturday mornings during the growing season and look at his no-till plants. His farm is about 30 k's from where I live. And look at his, and I would phone him up and I'd say, Kobus, maar jy het weer reën gekry. You've had rain again. And he would say, no, I haven't had any rain. I said, well, why your mealies still look alive and mine are dying? So I started watching Kobus's operation, and at the same time I'd run out of horsepower. I needed to change my tractors. But there was a problem that we'd run into dry years and I didn't have any money to buy. So I thought, well, I'll have a go at no-till farming. And thank goodness that I did. Another benefit that we have from no-till farming is that we never have any tractors getting stuck in the mud anymore. It was a problem, an ongoing problem. We have got rid of our markers on our planters. We don't have markers anymore. We feel they waste time. And my drivers, funny enough, there are some markers on that, but we didn't use them. My drivers have got so used to planting without markers. I was on the combine at times this year, and very, very rarely do you get your last row or your adjoining row out of kilt. Maybe veers slightly. Very, very rarely does it come. So we've got rid of our markers. We still spray with the Jacto sprayer down the row. But the time will come when we might go from 90 centimeters to 76s, but I find it convenient to spray down the row. But I know a lot of farmers with big sprayers are spraying across. Quibus does it. He sprays across. I think with time, there will come a time when crops, even like peanuts and potatoes, will be planted with no-till. I think that the conservative agricultural farming is still in its infant years. We are only really just starting to scratch the surface with CA. But if you see where we've come from, it's been a giant step for many of us who do it. My history teacher used to like to tell me at school that you cannot write history before 100 years has passed because you're too close to the event to judge it accurately. I think when history comes to judge CA, we will see it, or they will see it, as a significant turning point in food production and the preservation of our planet. What are the overall benefits of no-till to me? No wind erosion. What would somebody pay to have no wind blowing? What would I pay to have no wind blowing? You can't put a price on it. B, we have got very flat fields, so we don't have a great runoff water problem. There we have a slight runoff problem even on no-till farms, but we'd had about 8 inches in a week. And that is the only place on my entire farms where we saw a bit of water holding up. We've got no water runoff anymore. A couple of years ago when I just started, we'd had a heavy shower of about 50 millimeters. And my neighbor drove past the farm and said to me, "What's happened? Didn't you get that rain?" And I said, "No, I got it. I got about 50 millimeters. He said, "Maar waar is die water?" No water had come out of my fields, and the water was streaming out of his cultivated lands. That's a huge plus for us, especially in our drier climates. We have got reduced passes over the fields. The amount of times we go into the fields now, we spray. We've sprayed now in the winter to kill the skraal ants and the John Deere bossy. We've done that. We feel we need to do that. We have reduced passes over the fields. Tractors, as I say, would be preferred to stand in the sheds than be in the fields. We've got certainly got longer tractor lives. You open our filters, our air filters, we do them regularly, and every time we open them up and close them up, they look all right. Very little dust, very little dust. The amount of times that the district is blowing dust coming in from Boerewil, I drive onto the farm in a dust storm, get onto the farm, the wind's blowing, but there's no dust. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's a treasure that I can't begin to tell you what we've found. Less time for our drivers spent on tractors. They used to disc, they used to chisel plow, they used to mark, They used to scaffold, they used to cultivate, they used to plant, they used to cultivate again. Our tractor drivers are a very relaxed bunch of guys now. Very little work. And of course, fuel consumption. Gone right down, right down. I did some figures last year. It was a dry year, and we didn't do much field work last year. But when I did the figures, and also we had very little combining costs, very little fuel costs on combining last year. I did the figures, and I thought, well, I'm not going to tell anybody because nobody's going to believe me. The fuel costs are dramatically down. We've got less equipment needs. I'm farming 1,100 hectares, 1,150 hectares of maize and sunflower now. I've got 3 planters, 3 6-row Venstudo no-till planters. I've got a handful of tractors. I've got a Jacto sprayer. That's it. The other huge benefit to no-till planting is that we're planting earlier on less rain. Many, many times in the beginning of the season, normally the last weekend in October, we get a rain. If we don't get rain in the last weekend of October, we can go until early November without rain. I mean into the middle of November and even later. So we normally get our early rains in the late October, and then it's normally not a big rain. It's 10 or 15 or 20 millimeters. And if you've got underground reserve moisture like we've got this year, if you get 20 millimeters of rain, you can plant. That is a huge plus for no-till farming. We don't have to go and cultivate. We don't have to go and loosen the soil again. We can go straight in and plant. We've got no more cutworm problems. I'm glad to hear the talk that has just come before me. For whatever reason, we don't have cutworms anymore. And it was a very big problem. And it was standard practice in the Jacto sprayer. It was standard practice to put cypermethrin in with our weedicides. We don't do it anymore. We've got very few. I did an experiment last year, and some of you know that I was doing it. I bought 2 strip tillers. I bought 2 4-row strip tillers because I was concerned about a compaction problem on. We are not the sandy soil that Viljoenskroon and Bothaville are known for. We're not the dead Weisand, as they call it. So I was concerned about strip tilling, concerned about compaction. So I bought 2 strip tillers and put them in, and it looked very nice and looked very impressive, but I succeeded in planting a whole lot of mealy seeds, which GM mealies came up and caused me a problem because I then had to go in with another spray to kill them. So this year, I'm going to just let the strip tillers stand for a year and see. And everybody, when I did buy them, said, but why are you doing it? Have you checked your compaction levels? And I have checked them, but we've come out of a long, long, long line of ripping and plowing our soils. And we're nervous. We're still nervous, even after all these years of compaction problems. So we don't have opslag anymore, unless you do that. I've got no means of measuring the increased microbial life in the soil. Our soil scientists can do that, maar ons is net gewone boere. We don't have the ability, we don't have the time, and we don't have the patience to go and catch a whole lot of ladybugs. That's what those guys do, and they do it very successfully, and fantastic work they've done there. Earthworms, I'm sorry to say, are still not as active on our sandy soils as they should be. The bottom of this land, you will get onto a bit of turf where the water stands. Incredibly, on the black turf soils, and we've got very little of it, you will see a lot of earthworm activity. And even on the Van Akkers, you will see a lot of earthworm activity. When it gets wet, the earthworms are everywhere except there. I don't know why. But one must remember that some of these soils have been plowed for 100 years. No wonder there are no earthworms. We have got problems with no-till, conservative agriculture. One of them is kweekgras. Kweekgras is a problem. There are ways of killing kweekgras. One of them is to go in the winter and either disturb it or plow it with a plow without moldboards on it. The other answer is in the autumn to spray it with 6 liters of Roundup. That kills it. But it's a very resilient chap, and he is becoming a problem, a very big problem for us. So, to sum up, what are the benefits of no-till farming to me in my adventure into no-till farming? I never, ever give wind erosion a thought. Never. It doesn't come into my vocabulary. I don't think about it. I never worry about it. And that must surely be a huge plus. If you've experienced wind blowing, as I said in the beginning, you would trade anything to stop wind blowing. Remember a couple of years ago at the Rotary Club speaking to a fellow farmer of mine who was farming in the sandy areas. He'd cultivated, he'd put the windploeg in so many times, he had resorted then to taking old peanut hay and driving down the rows of mealies and scattering the peanut hay just to try and stop the wind. That's how bad it is and was and still is in certain places. You've seen pictures of the road, the Bothaville-Wipstad Road, where the sand covers the tar road. Those days are gone for me. Ladies and gentlemen, I asked you in the beginning, what price would you sell your no-till idea for? Would you be prepared to sell it? You found this treasure. It didn't cost you anything. It might have cost you to change your mind, change your implements. But you found this treasure, like the man in the Bible who found a treasure in a field and he did everything. Take August for example. He found a treasure and we've only got one life. He was prepared to give up his whole life to follow his dream, follow his calling. He found a treasure, a priceless treasure. Not all of us get that. We're not all called to the ministry. But as farmers who have the old way, scoffling and chisel ploughing and ploughing, we have now got the opportunity and we have found it. And it's free. It's free. We found this treasure of great value. I wouldn't sell my idea. I need to thank people like Richard and you, Natal Farmers, for pioneering it. A guy like Cobus van Colle who showed us the way. I got it for free. And I'm not going to change it. I would be prepared to drop in Heald to continue to do it. And I think in cases we have dropped in Heald. We have dropped in Heald because it would appear that the chaps who are still chisel ploughing and ripping, their yields look better than ours. But I would be prepared to change that extra Heald for the security of no wind blowing, building up my soils. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a while to build up our soils, to build up our stubble, and best of all, to have no wind blowing. So, if you ask me, would I sell my no-till idea? Yeah, I'd sell it, but then I would sell my farms as well. I'd be out of it. I'm not going back to the old way. I don't think I have to convince any of you sitting here to go back to the old way. But as I said in the beginning, what is it about as South African farmers that this concept of no-till hasn't gone like a bushfire through the country? What is it about us? What is it? Are we stubborn? I don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity. Richard, for speaking. I hope I've contributed something. I hope that somehow, anyone who's ever doubted changing to conservative agriculture would have changed their mind. But I continue to say thank you to you guys who did all the pioneering work, the spade work, the donkey work, to get us to where we are.
Ken, before you disappear, chaps, Anthony and I, we often wonder where God is in our lives. And Ken was one of those occasions when I knew God was in my life. Anthony and I went to Pretoria to a meeting to discuss no-till. And during that meeting, we had a number of fellows who said to us, doesn't work, and especially no-till in Viljoenskroon, Bothaville, nee, dit sal nooit werk nie, die grond is anderste, alles. We came back, flew back to Maritzburg, and I said to Anthony, hell, are we wasting our time? I felt moodless, despair, and I thought, no. I had never, ever met Ken. I'd never heard from him. But the following week, I got an email of about 8 lines saying, thank you for carrying on promoting no-till. I have adopted no-till in Viljoenskroon, and I am going to have a crop this year which my neighbor hasn't got. I knew it wasn't toevallig, that wasn't a mistake. God was sending me a message to say, carry on. Here's your encouragement. And I praise him for that. And thank you, Ken, for being part of that.
Thanks, Anthony.